The woman's eyes didn't blink. "You won't survive the night here," she whispered, her voice more pity than menace. Julia laughed then, nervous, unsure, but when she turned around, the dusty township seemed to breathe, as if watching her. Hours later, her guest house would vanish. And someone would call her by a name no one alive should know. She came for culture, for experience. But what if she wasn't here by chance at all? What if she was summoned? Why did they say she was meant to return? Julia stepped off the bus into a heat so thick it felt like it clung to her bones. The South African village of Mamapolo wasn't on any travel guide, and that was precisely why she came. With a background of rolling bushveld and corrugated metal rooftops reflecting the sun like signal mirrors, Mamapolo seemed untouched by time. Locals peered through shaded doorways as she walked by with her backpack and camera, their eyes curious but guarded. She was used to this reception in rural places, hesitation followed by warmth once trust was earned. But this time, the silence didn't thaw. Her guest house was supposedly on the edge of the village, a modest hut listed on an obscure travel blog as a cultural immersion for the fearless. As she passed a fruit vendor with a weathered face and piercing stare, the woman called out in a thick accent, "You shouldn't be here, Cece." Julia stopped. The woman pointed at the horizon, where the sun hovered low like a dying lantern. "You won't survive the night here." Julia smiled awkwardly, assuming it was a warning about wildlife, maybe crime. But the woman shook her head slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the stall's edge. "Not you. Not tonight. The air has changed." Julia wanted to ask more, but the woman turned away and refused to speak further. The village seemed to exhale around her. Dogs barked in the distance, a door slammed 3 huts away, and a sudden wind picked up dust that danced in spirals. She finally found the guest house. It was quaint, made of red clay bricks and thatch, and the owner, an older man named Tumi, was warm but distracted, often looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone else. She settled in, eager to prove that the warning was just superstition. As night crept in, she wandered outside with her camera, drawn to the echoing drums in the distance. A group of children ran by, barefoot and giggling, but when they saw her, they stopped cold. One of them whispered something to the others before they scattered, leaving Julia standing alone beneath a sky too quiet, too dark. The silence wasn't natural. It was the kind that made your ears ring. She returned to the guest house, but the door was ajar. Inside, the owner was gone, and so was her backpack. The bedsheets were folded as if no one had ever stayed there. A shiver danced down her spine as she stepped outside again. That's when she noticed it. No lights in the entire village. Not even a candle flickering in a window. Julia looked back at the market square, but it wasn't there anymore. The fruit stall, the woman, gone. Replaced by an empty field of dry grass. She stumbled backward, her pulse pounding. That's when a voice behind her said softly, "You stayed too long." She turned, but no one was there. Her breath caught. The moon, once full, was now a sliver, though less than 2 hours had passed. Julia clutched the journal in her pocket, her lifeline. She flipped to the last entry and found a new one she hadn't written. It read, "She must return. Before the sun eats her." Julia dropped the book. Something in the air had shifted. The village was not just a village. And this wasn't just a warning. It was a countdown. Long before Julia ever stepped foot in South Africa, she had become a master of leaving. She never admitted it aloud, but her life was made up of half-finished moments and farewells disguised as wanderlust. Her childhood had ended the day her mother's car flipped 3 times off a rainy cliffside road and her father, once her anchor, crumbled under the weight of grief and debt. Julia was only 11 when she overheard a neighbor whisper, "That girl's gonna run for the rest of her life," and it had clung to her like a shadow. Her teenage years blurred into a revolving door of guardians, suitcases, and changing zip codes. By 19, she had a passport full of stamps and no address to call home. Every country was a chapter in her ongoing attempt to outrun the silence of that crash, the way her father stopped looking her in the eye, the way no one told her where her mother was buried. She didn't just travel to see the world, she traveled to escape the feeling that something vital had been taken from her and never returned. Her journal was sacred, filled with scraps of maps, dried flower petals from Himalayan trails, ferry tickets from Greek islands, and scribbled thoughts she never dared speak aloud. But nowhere in those pages had she mentioned South Africa. It was a spontaneous decision, a booking made during a layover in Istanbul when her phone glitched and displayed an image of a tree she couldn't name. It showed up again days later on a stranger's scarf in Morocco, and then once more, graffitied in a forgotten alley in Nairobi. An intricate tree with wide roots and spiraling branches that seemed to call to her. She had chalked it up to coincidence, another strange moment in a traveler's life. But now, standing in a place that seemed to rewrite itself as she breathed, she wasn't so sure. There were moments in her life when Julia felt like the universe was nudging her, but this was different. It wasn't a nudge, it was a pull. And it was growing stronger. As a child, she'd had vivid dreams of being chased through jungles, her hands stained with red clay, hearing a lullaby in a language she couldn't understand. At the time, therapists called it trauma. But one night, at the guest house before it vanished, she heard the same melody drifting in from outside her window. Her body went rigid, her breath caught in her chest. That lullaby hadn't haunted her in years. She thought she had imagined it. But in that moment, she knew, this place, somehow, knew her. Her father never spoke of her mother's family. Julia had assumed they were dead, estranged, or irrelevant. But now, fragments began to surface. A photo she once found in a showbox of her mother in front of a vast tree with twisted roots, holding a small child that looked just like Julia. A letter she barely remembered, tucked into an old copy of Cry, the Beloved Country, signed with a name she didn't recognize, from Kulu, who waits for your return. She had dismissed it then as a memento from her mother's travels, maybe a nickname from a friend. But now, the word echoed through her like a thunderclap, Mkulu. Grandfather. In Zulu. Was it possible her mother had ties to this land? To this village? That Julia herself was more than just a wandering outsider stumbling into something ancient and dangerous. She thought of the woman at the fruit stall, the warning not spoken in fear, but certainty. Julia had always believed her rootlessness was a consequence of tragedy. But what if it was something deeper? Something inherited? The night air in Mamapolo tasted of soil and smoke, of memories buried too long. She remembered her father's final words to her before he disappeared into a haze of alcohol and vanishing bank statements. You're just like her. You follow ghosts. She thought he meant her obsession with the past. But now she wondered, what if he meant it literally? Her fingertips brushed the cover of her journal again, and this time, she noticed something pressed between the pages, an old postcard she didn't remember packing. It bore a photo of the same tree she had seen before. On the back, scrawled in neat, slanted handwriting were 5 words, home waits. But not forever. Her throat tightened. A gust of wind slammed the shutter open behind her, and in the moonlight, she could see the outline of something carved into the clay wall of the hut. The same tree. Only this time, it had a figure standing beneath it, hands raised, as if in offering. Julia had always thought she was running from something. But what if she had been running toward it? Julia's shoes crunched against dry gravel as she returned from the tribal market just past dusk, the last strands of sunset curling like smoke along the distant hills. She clutched a small woven pouch given to her by a child who hadn't spoken a word, only stared at her wide-eyed before pressing it into her palm and sprinting off. The market had been surreal, row after row of goods too old and too specific to feel like souvenirs. Carved bone pendants with symbols she didn't recognize, jars of dust labeled with names of stars, a woman chanting to no one in a corner, her eyes completely white. Julia had left early, unnerved by how the vendors didn't try to sell her anything but watched her as if she was something on display. The path back to her guest house was still burned into her memory. She had followed the same route earlier that day, snapping pictures of that crooked fence post with a missing top, the shack with a yellow door that smelled of baked clay, the twisted tree with a bone charm tied to its trunk. But when she arrived at the spot where her guest house should have stood, her breath caught in her throat. There was nothing. No thatched roof. No clay brick walls. No sign of habitation at all. Just a patch of bare earth, smooth and undisturbed as if no structure had ever stood there. Panic began to ripple through her like a fever. She circled the area, checking her photos to confirm the location, but even the trees in her camera roll looked wrong. Their angles were different, as if nature itself had rearranged during her absence. She sprinted to where the path forked toward the main square, but it wasn't a square anymore, just a wide expanse of overgrown brush, like no one had walked it in years. The vibrant market she had just left behind had completely vanished. There were no sounds of merchants, no smoke rising from fires, no distant drums. The silence roared in her ears. She dropped to her knees and clawed at the earth where her room had been, hoping to feel something, an edge of foundation, a buried tile, anything, but found only dry soil. Her mind fought to stay rational, to find explanations. Hallucination. Gas leak. Dream. But she knew dreams didn't make your heart race this way, didn't make your hands bleed when you scraped them against stone. The only thing still in her possession was the woven pouch. She opened it and gasped. It contained a key. Her room key. Its number, 4, was etched in the same font as the one on the wooden tag Tumi had given her. But it was warm. Too warm. As if someone had been holding it tightly until moments before. Julia spun around, scanning the area for any sign of life. That's when she saw the child again, standing far off by the tree line, watching her. She called out, but the child vanished behind a curve in the landscape. Julia ran after her, desperate for any anchor to reality. The path narrowed into an opening lined with strange stone markers that pulsed faintly in the dark. Her phone had no signal, no compass, no timestamps on her photos, only black voids where time had been. She stumbled deeper into the woods, breath shallow, ears straining for sounds, any confirmation she was not completely alone. The air thickened. There was a scent, wet iron and ash, and then she heard something behind her. Footsteps. Deliberate. She turned quickly, heart slamming into her ribs, but there was no one. Just the wind brushing through the reeds. Then, from the corner of her eye, she noticed the journal in her back pocket had begun to glow faintly. She flipped it open and saw a new page inked in a hand not her own. This is not the place you left. You are closer now. Her knees buckled. She sank against a tree, clutching the journal as her world unraveled. She didn't know how long she sat there, time disjointed and elastic. Eventually, a soft humming drifted through the air, the lullaby again, haunting and sweet, coming from deep within the forest. She rose shakily and followed it, each step feeling heavier, like the soil was tugging at her. The trees grew denser, older, roots sprawling like veins. Ahead, a single hut stood, round, stone-walled, with smoke curling from a hole in the roof. It looked ancient, far older than the village she had seen earlier. As she approached, a woman stepped out, her skin wrinkled like folded bark, her eyes clouded with cataracts. She looked directly at Julia and spoke in perfect English. "Your mother lit the same fire. Do you remember where she hid the ashes?" Julia froze, her mind reeling. Before she could speak, the woman pointed to the pouch and said, "You've unlocked the door. But not the truth." Behind the hut was a narrow opening in the trees, and though fear screamed at her to run, Julia stepped through it. And the last thing she saw before the world blinked again was a carved stone slab in the shape of the same tree from her visions, and beneath it, her name. Not Julia. Not the name on her passport. But a name she had never heard before, written in a language she didn't know, yet understood. Julia pushed through the veil of vines as the trail narrowed into a corridor of twisted trees, their branches clawing at her clothes like skeletal fingers. Every step away from the village felt like descending into a different realm entirely. The air thickened, less oxygen and more memory, as if she were inhaling the past lives of the forest itself. Insects ceased their humming, birds no longer called from the treetops, and even the wind grew cautious, only daring to stir when she wasn't looking. Her feet moved instinctively, guided not by logic but by some subterranean pull that seemed to vibrate beneath the soil. Then came the markings, symbols etched into the bark, spirals within spirals, circles with jagged lines through them, recurring motifs of a tree with 3 roots and 1 eye in the center of its trunk. They appeared too frequently to be accidents, too precise to be graffiti. As she advanced, a structure loomed ahead, partially hidden behind thick brush and tall reeds. It wasn't a home. It was a compound, high, crumbling walls covered in ivy and thorns, guarded by carved totems that radiated both warning and welcome. A gate stood ajar, its hinges shrieking when she nudged it open. Inside, the ground dipped into a sunken clearing, and Julia crouched behind a broken column, heart racing. She had stumbled into something sacred, or profane, maybe both. There were people, at least a dozen, robed in deep crimson fabric, standing in a circle around a fire that didn't crackle but whispered, its flames oddly blue and pulsing like breath. They spoke in tongues she didn't recognize, a language that seemed too old for vocal cords, and their cadence was hypnotic, designed to lull or summon or both. One figure in particular stood out, taller than the rest, wearing a mask carved from bone with obsidian inlays where the eyes should be. He, or she, held a staff made from the same wood as the dream tree, its tip glowing faintly. Julia dared not breathe. The firelight danced across the ground, revealing symbols drawn in ash, one of which mirrored the strange name she'd seen etched beneath the tree earlier. Her name. Not a label but an identity, as if the land had been waiting for her to remember. Suddenly, all heads turned in unison toward her hiding spot. No one spoke. No one moved. But the air shifted. And a low chant began again, this time accompanied by drums that hadn't been there seconds ago. Julia panicked, darting backward, rustling too loudly. A hand reached from behind a tree and covered her mouth before she could scream. It was the boy from the village, the one who had vanished at the edge of the market. Up close, he looked older than he had before, his eyes too knowing for someone who couldn't be more than 12. "You can't let them see you yet," he whispered, in perfect English. "They'll think you're ready. You're not." He pulled her into the shadows and led her through a narrow tunnel of brambles. As they emerged on the other side, Julia glanced back to find the compound gone, replaced by a field of dry grass swaying harmlessly in the wind. "Why are you helping me?" she asked breathlessly. "Because you're not supposed to die here," he replied. "Not yet." He handed her a folded paper. Inside was a map drawn in charcoal, marked with excess and runes, and a phrase written at the bottom in that same cryptic tongue. Beneath it, a translation. "Blood remembers what memory forgets." Before she could ask more, the boy was gone. She wondered until night fell again, the stars above cold and unfamiliar. Her mind wrestled with the edges of reason, grasping for anchors that no longer existed. She opened the journal, hoping for an answer, and found a new page added. It depicted the compound she had just seen, sketched with uncanny precision. At the bottom was a single sentence, "Your mother saw the same fire." Tears sprang to her eyes. Was this madness? Memory? Or a message left by a woman who had not died when they said she had? Julia's breath trembled as she tucked the page away and climbed a ridge that overlooked the forest. In the distance, the blue fire sparked again, brief, pulsing like a heartbeat, before fading into the night. Whispers swirled in the wind. Not voices, but thoughts, as if the trees themselves carried memories in their bark. She stood there until morning light spilled across the horizon, not warming her, but illuminating the truth. She had not wandered into this. She had been led. The next night arrived with no fanfare, just an eerie stillness that seemed to hum beneath the surface of the air, like something vast was inhaling just out of sight. Julia found herself back near the ridge, tracing the boy's map through jagged terrain and thorn-covered hillsides, led more by instinct than understanding. The trees thinned into a wide, flat plateau crowned by a ring of standing stones that pulsed faintly under the moonlight. In the center stood a figure cloaked in black, her silhouette cutting cleanly through the fog that clung to the ground. Julia approached cautiously, but the woman didn't move. When she finally turned, Julia froze, not because she was threatening, but because her face was so familiar. She had the same cheekbones, the same crescent-shaped scar above her brow that Julia had seen in a photograph of her mother as a teenager. Yet this woman was older than the photo, and her eyes held a weight that made Julia's knees wobble. "You've finally come," the woman said softly, as if greeting an old friend who had simply arrived late. "I was afraid they'd take you before you made it here." Julia's throat closed, her mind flailing for sense. "Who are you?" she croaked. The woman stepped forward, her voice low and steady. "My name is Cello. I knew your mother long before the world thought she died. She was one of us. And so are you." Julia staggered back. "No. That's not possible. My mother, she died in a car crash." Cello shook her head slowly. "That's what they wanted your father to believe. He was not one of us. They made him forget. But she didn't die. She was taken, because she remembered things she was supposed to forget. The words fell like stones into a lake, rippling through Julia's psyche, stirring up every question she had never dared ask. "Why me?" she whispered. Cello's gaze didn't waver. "Because your blood carries what hers carried, memory. And now they've awakened to your presence. You must finish what she began." She gestured to the journal in Julia's hands. "You think you're writing in that book, but you're not. It's writing through you. It's a record, an inheritance. One your mother barely had time to leave behind." Julia opened it, pages fluttering in the wind, and found a spread she had never seen before, a full drawing of the compound she'd found in the forest, symbols matching those etched into the totems, and at the center, a woman cloaked in fire, arms outstretched. Beneath it were 5 words: "She burns to light the path." Cello continued, "They'll want you to perform the offering. They believe it will complete the circle. But that path was meant for someone else. Not you." Julia's chest tightened. "Then who?" Cello looked skyward. "Your mother." But she chose to hide instead. They never forgave her. Suddenly the air around them cracked, a thunderous sound, like splitting bone, and a pulse of blue light exploded behind one of the standing stones. Figures emerged from the dark, their faces painted in ash and ochre, hands carrying torches that didn't flicker. Julia backed away instinctively, but Cello grabbed her arm. "If they take you now, it's over. You'll forget. Like your father did. You'll wake up in some city, lost and broken, never knowing why you cry at the smell of rain." The procession drew closer, chanting low and rhythmic, like the earth itself was speaking through them. Cello pressed a small object into Julia's palm, a pendant shaped like the tree from her visions, etched in bone and strung on braided wire. "This was hers," Cello said. "If you wear it, they can't take your memory. But it will also make them hunt you harder." The decision was impossible, cruel in its consequences. But Julia slipped the pendant around her neck anyway. As soon as it touched her skin, something unlocked behind her eyes. Flashes of her mother's face, not in pain, but laughing, dancing around a fire, holding baby Julia against her chest as robed figures watched from the trees. And then a final image, her mother whispering to someone, "Hide her. Make her forget." Julia stumbled as the wave of emotion crashed over her. She looked up, breath ragged, just as the robed figures reached the ring of stones. One of them stepped forward, taller than the rest, masked in bone and feathers. His voice rang out, impossibly loud. "Nkatha." Julia blinked. What did he call me? Cello's face had gone pale. "That's your true name. The one they gave you before your mother took you away. It means the one who remembers for all." Julia's heart thundered. How do they know it? Cello looked at her with a sadness that cut deep. "Because they named you." The morning sun crawled across the savannah like a slow-burning wick, and Julia stood beneath the ancient baobab tree, its trunk impossibly wide, gnarled with age, its hollow center dark as a wound. The pendant around her neck throbbed with a strange warmth, and the whispers in her head were no longer fragmented. They formed sentences, memories, names she'd never known but felt carved into her bones. The circle had assembled around her once more, robed figures standing at the edge of the clearing in perfect silence. At the center stood the masked figure who had called her Nkatha, and beside him was an altar draped in crimson cloth and braided reed. Cello was gone. Julia hadn't seen her since the previous night, but she could feel her presence in the wind, in the soil, in the tension pressing against her chest. In front of the altar sat a bowl carved from obsidian, filled with something that shimmered like mercury. A voice boomed, though no mouth moved. "The offering completes the memory. The fire seals the forgetting. The blood binds the return." The sky above felt oppressive, heavy with choice. Julia stepped forward, the earth buzzing beneath her bare feet. "What happens if I refuse?" she asked, her voice steady but raw. The masked figure didn't answer, but the others began to hum, a low vibration that made the leaves tremble. The pendant seared against her chest, and images cascaded through her. Her mother bound in vines, whispering into a windless cave, her father screaming into an empty crib, herself floating in a river, watched by unseen eyes. These were not memories. These were truths, ones withheld, ones stored in her like seeds. Another voice, softer this time, rose from behind her. She turned. It was the boy again. He looked older now, his eyes sorrowful. If you give them your blood, they'll let you remember everything. But you won't leave. She stared at him, torn. And if I don't? His gaze dropped to the dirt. You'll forget all of this. Wake up somewhere else. Alone. Safe. But empty. Julia's breath hitched. The bowl shimmered again, and the masked figure extended a blade, not toward her, but toward himself. He pressed it into his own palm and let his blood spill into the bowl, turning the liquid a deep violet. Then he held the blade out to her. Remember, the chant began, or forget. The baobab behind her groaned, its bark pulsing like skin. It was alive. It was aware. And it was waiting. She approached the altar, hand trembling. The journal in her pouch suddenly felt heavy, as if it too was holding its breath. She looked around at the circle, then back at the boy. His eyes were pleading. This isn't a ritual, he whispered. It's a test. They want to see if you'll choose to carry the weight. Like she did. A wind tore through the clearing, scattering leaves and ash. The pendant glowed white-hot. Julia raised the blade, hovered it above her palm, then stopped. For a full breathless moment, she looked up at the tree, then at the sky, then back to the bowl. With a scream, she hurled the blade into the dirt and backed away. No, she said. I choose neither. I choose myself. Chaos erupted. The chanting fractured into wails, the sky darkened, and the earth cracked in a thunderous roar. The baobab's roots tore from the ground, snaking toward her. But before they could reach her, the pendant burst into blinding light, sending a shockwave that knocked the circle flat. Julia collapsed to her knees, hands over her ears, the wind shrieking with rage. And then, silence. She opened her eyes. The altar was gone. The circle was gone. Even the tree had vanished, leaving only a ring of scorched earth and the faint smell of lightning. The boy stood at the edge of the clearing, fading slowly like mist. You broke the circle, he said. That's never happened before. Julia rose shakily, her heart thundering. What happens now? The boy smiled faintly. Now, you remember on your own. And with that, he was gone. Julia turned and walked into the rising light, unsure of where she was going but no longer afraid. Her memory was intact. Her story was her own. And in the journal, now blank, one final message appeared. You were never lost. Just waiting to return.